In the name of the African ancestors who began the march of humankind in the womb of Mother Africa, we ask these ancestors to be with us, to strengthen us, and give us a vision for the future. In the name of the African ancestors who began the march of humankind in the womb of Mother Africa and marched down the Nile, laying the foundations for human civilization and culture, we ask these Africans to be with us, to strengthen us, and give us a vision for the future. In the name of these African ancestors who built their pyramids and their temples to their God concepts, to their principles, and to their moral values, who left us a legacy of architectural and monumental building unparalleled in the history of the world, we ask these ancestors who built the pyramids, who built the temples, to be with us, to strengthen us, and give us a vision for the future. We ask these African ancestors who took this African culture and extended it throughout Africa, building the stone cities of Zimbabwe, building the empires of the Sudan, Ghana, Mali, and Songhai, building the Swahili city-states along the east coast of Africa, and in Christian Africa, asking King Lalibela and giving him the courage to build the 12 churches of Lalibela from the ground down, monuments to the world. We ask these Africans who spread this culture to the Dogo and to the Akan and to the Yoruba and to the Bankango and to the Zulu. We ask these Africans to be with us, to strengthen us, and give us a vision for the future. In the name of the Africans who opened up Africa, opened up the Nile Valley to other cultures and other peoples, and they came in and nurtured themselves on the African greatness. First coming in early with the ancient Hebrews, and they synthesized this culture and produced Judaism. Later coming in were the Christians, and they synthesized this culture and produced Christianity. Coming in were also the Greeks, who took the African culture, synthesized it, and produced Greek civilization. And then later, the Prophet Muhammad, and with the Arabs coming into the Nile Valley, they synthesized the culture and produced Islam. We ask these African ancestors, who as part of their legacy laid the foundations for Judaism, Christianity, Islam, and Greek civilization, to be with us, to strengthen us, and give us a vision for the future. We ask those African ancestors pulled out of Africa, taken to the hells of North America, South America, the Caribbean, maintaining the spirit of African humanity in their hearts and in their minds, and who left us this enormous legacy of struggle. We ask those Africans who resisted enslavement in the villages of Africa, who resisted enslavement in the shores of Africa, who resisted enslavement in those forts and dungeons, who resisted enslavement in the holes of those ships, who resisted enslavement when they arrived on these shores in the New World. We ask these Africans who ran into the highlands of northeast Brazil and established for 100 years the first free republic in the Americas, the Republic of Palmares, and their last great leader, Zumbi, whose spirit and sacrifice. We asked these Africans who replicated the Brazilian experience and went into the highlands of Jamaica and became the maroon-free communities. We asked these Africans who went into the backwoods of the Guyanas and Suriname and created free republic of the Suramaka and the Ajuka. We asked these Africans who went into the backwoods of Georgia and the swamps of Florida and moved with the Seminole Indians and resisted oppression. We ask these Africans who left us a legacy of struggle and resistance, the likes of which no one in the world has, to be with us, to strengthen us, and give us a vision for the future. We ask these Africans who created and laid for us a foundation of struggle and resistance that was passed on generation after generation, that was passed on to Harriet Tubman, who fought her way out of enslavement and became a symbol of freedom for all of us. Similarly, Frederick Douglass and hundreds of thousands of others fought their way out of enslavement. We asked those Africans who went with Boukman Dessalines to create the greatest revolutionary experience in the history of the world, the Haitian Revolution, leaving us a legacy, the likes of which no one else has had. We ask these Africans to be with us, to strengthen us, and give us a vision for the future.
I want to say good morning to you and welcome to the Running African Show. It's now 12 minutes after 6. Roots Rocking Reggae Radio. DigiChris sitting in studios on behalf of Kabu Mahad Karu. And this morning we'll be having some special features. Just like last week, we had some rebroadcast interviews, and that's what we'll be doing today again. So sit back, relax, and enjoy. It's the Running African Show for Sunday, September 28, 2014. Hey guys, so welcome back. It's the Running African Show. DigiChris sitting in on behalf of Kabu Mahad Karu. I want to say big up to our friends on the World Wide Web. Our friends down in Africa in Cape Town. It's 3:23 p.m. In Johannesburg, it's 3:23 too. And Addis Ababa, 4:23 the time over there. And Accra, it's 1:23. All right, we're going to get back to some Musecast interview on China's Angola model with Professor David Chin, adjunct professor of international affairs at the George Washington University Elliott School of International Affairs. And this was aired on November 10, 2013. Now to our special feature, our first feature.
All right, we want to go talk about China in Africa. And our very special guest in this segment of the program is the former ambassador to Ethiopia, Ambassador David Chin. We have been telling you about him all morning. And he's just co-authored the book China and Africa, A Century of Engagement, published by the University of Pennsylvania Press, 2012. He joins me right now after this.
Running African, reuniting the African family for development.
All right, as we go to the phone lines to speak with Ambassador David Chin. Ambassador Chin, good morning. Thank you very much for joining us on the program.
Good morning.
All right, I must apologize for a few minutes late start as we try to deal with an issue of public access here in Jamaica. We have been talking a lot, Ambassador, about China in Africa here in Jamaica because we think it's also relevant to us because of we're the African diaspora, but also because of China's own interest and engagement with the Caribbean. Our discussion this morning really is to understand a bit more about China's engagement with Africa. And you are that person who has been focused heavily on that. We have been citing your work here in this space. We have been reading your research on China and Africa. Can you tell us, first of all, a little bit about the historical aspect of China's engagement with Africa, the historical relationship?
Sure. The historical relationship actually is quite old. If you go back to the trading days of more than 2,000 years ago, when Chinese products were starting to go into Northeast Africa. But other than that, there was not much activity until the 15th century when you had the famous Chinese flotilla visiting Northeast Africa. And then you had another lapse all the way up really until the current government in China took an increased interest in Africa because of the rising number of countries in Africa that were becoming independent after the end of colonialism. And as a result, the number of countries that had a vote in the United Nations General Assembly and could therefore be in a position to support China in its effort to replace Taiwan on the Security Council of the United Nations. And that actually happened in 1970. And that was sort of a turning point in China's relationship with the African continent when, by 1970, clearly, a majority of the countries in Africa were more supportive of Beijing than they were of Taipei.
So, of course, a long and historic relationship between the two continents, between China and Africa. And now, in recent times, we see a different kind of engagement. How has that changed?
Well, it's changed pretty dramatically. If you go back to the 1960s, for example, China's primary interest in the continent was one of supporting those groups that were trying to end colonial rule. It was also supporting left-wing revolutionary groups in Africa. It did not have the finance or the capital to provide much by way of aid. Had one big project in the form of the Tanzania-Zambia Railway that's very well known, but with that and a few other exceptions, it was not providing much aid at all in the earlier years. As time went on, and the Chinese economy became much stronger, particularly by the time you get to the 1990s, the whole focus of China's effort in Africa was on the economic side, particularly using Africa as a source of raw materials for oil, cobalt, copper, iron ore, all kinds of things. and in turn selling Chinese manufactured goods to African countries. So the trade component of the relationship became critical, as did the transfer of financial resources to Africa that had been used for investment purposes, and now that side of the relationship is clearly the predominant one.
One of the things that I've heard you said in some of your lectures is that China's interest in Africa is fourfold in terms of the four principal interests. Can we talk about those a bit more and to develop on them too? Because you talk about the access to energy and increasing good relations, developing good relations, and Taiwan and so on. Can we look at those four principal interests of China in Africa today?
The first one is the one that I've already alluded to, and that is having access to Africa for raw materials, particularly oil and minerals. And that's quite straightforward, and I think if I had to prioritize these interests, I would put that at the top of the list. The second one is Africa as a market for Chinese goods, in other words, exporting Chinese products to Africa. And that's important because Africa is an increasingly wealthy part of the world. It has a growing middle class. It has the fastest growing population in the world, particularly sub-Saharan Africa. And it's a market of more than 1 billion people now. China is 1.3 billion, the largest country in the world. But it's a market that looks very attractive to China, and particularly the wealthier aspect of it. The third interest is simply obtaining the support of as many as possible of the 54 independent countries in Africa, in the United Nations and in other international fora like the World Trade Organization, because these countries, although they don't vote as a bloc, they do tend to vote in similar fashion, and that's important for Chinese interests, where they are also members of a particular international organization. And 54 countries does account for more than 1/4 of the entire membership of the United Nations. The fourth and somewhat related interest is to ensure that at some point all of the countries in Africa and indeed around the world, and particularly including the Caribbean, recognize Beijing and not Taipei. There are only 4 countries in Africa that now recognize Taipei, and there's actually something of a truce between Taiwan and mainland China at the moment on this issue of trying to take diplomatic representation away from the other country. Until the election of President Ma in Taiwan in 2008, there was very strong competition between Taipei and Beijing. But the Ma government in Taiwan has had a better relationship with Beijing, and they have informally agreed not to continue that competition, although that could return at some point in the future, particularly if there were a change of government on Taiwan that would be less friendly towards Beijing.
You're inside of the African Forum, and our very special guest on the lines, Ambassador David Chin, former ambassador to Ethiopia, now adjunct professor of international affairs at the George Washington University's Elliott School of International Affairs. We're talking about China in Africa, China-Africa relations. Ambassador, I want to look a little bit closer at the one of the interests, which is China's increasing access to energy. How does this play out on the ground in Africa, since this is one of the principal interests that China has with the continent of Africa?
Well, for the last 15 years or so, starting largely in Sudan, China has been looking for ways to access the very rich resources that exist in Africa, particularly oil, but also minerals that aid its industrial output. And it does so by either going in and offering to actually develop the oil resources, as was the case in Sudan, or it does so by arranging agreements with a country wealthy in oil like Angola, where it offers multi-billion-dollar loans for whatever purpose the government wants to use the loan. It then has the loans repaid to China in the form of oil or minerals being sent back to China, so there's almost a guarantee that the loan will be repaid. And then usually the government, in this case Angola, will use those multi-billion-dollar loans for large infrastructure projects, because other governments or organizations have not stepped forward and made similar offers, at least not of that magnitude. And as a result, you have going on in Angola today numerous huge infrastructure projects, the building of roads, rehabilitating the railway, improving ports, airports, all kinds of major infrastructure. And they're all being done by Chinese companies, because the original loan from the government of China is almost always tied to work from a Chinese company. So it works out very well for China to have the loans being paid back in the form of oil in the case of Angola, and virtually a guarantee that Chinese companies will take advantage of the loan, because the government of Angola wants infrastructure projects, and there are a number of large Chinese construction companies that are very capable of doing these projects.
You have, and I find this really fascinating, and thanks for the work that you've done in this regard. Talked about the Angola model, and I find for myself that this has helped me to understand a bit more of how China is engaging with the continent. And I want you to help us to understand that also broadly, our audience. What exactly is this Angola model? I hear you give us an idea of what it is just now by talking about the enormous loans and how these loans are tied to Chinese labor and expertise and so on. But do we see this? Is this a model, a strategy that is being used by China across the continent, and if so, how?
Well, it's a model that is being replicated in some countries. This model really only works in the case of African countries that have significant raw materials that China is interested in. And that does, of course, limit the number of countries. As a result, you see it being used in the Congo, in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, not with oil, because the DRC does not have that much oil, but it has enormous mineral wealth. So the similar model has developed in the DRC, but using minerals as the way to pay off the loan. You're seeing it to a lesser extent in countries like Niger, which does have modest amounts of oil, and in Ghana, which has fairly significant amounts of oil, and in a few other countries. But one must remember that many African countries are still quite poor, and they just are not in a position to offer repayment in the form of valuable raw materials. Ethiopia is a case in point. It has received several $1 billion worth of loans, concessionary loans. These are loans at very reasonable terms in terms of the interest rate and repayment arrangements. But Ethiopia is a rather poor country. It has a very limited amount of gold, and otherwise it has agricultural products, mainly coffee, which is not of great interest to Chinese since they don't drink that much coffee. And as a result, one has to wonder how easy it will be for Ethiopia to repay these multi-billion-dollar loans. Now, in the case of Ethiopia, the total amount is much less than for Angola. But it still may be difficult in the next 15, 20 years for Ethiopia to pay back all of this money to China.
Okay, you're listening to the Running African Show, and if you're just joining, it's a rebroadcast interview with Dr. David Chin. We're going to a break.
Angola model, how is it tied to labor?
Well, that's a very interesting question, and one about which there's a lot of mythology and a lot of confusion, and it's also one where it's sometimes difficult to get all the facts. In the case of Angola, it's I think the numbers are fairly well documented. When China and Angola sat down to agree on terms for how to use these multi-billion-dollar loans, and Angola made the decision that it wanted to use the money for large infrastructure projects, which was a reasonable decision. Then China said, well, okay, and we will tie them to Chinese companies. Angola said that's fine because China had a pretty good record with its construction projects done by Chinese companies. But then the question of labor came up. And that was a negotiated point where Angola, of course, wanted a maximum amount of Angolan labor, and China wanted a maximum amount of Chinese labor. The original agreement, as I understand it, is that 70% of the labor would be Angolan and 30% would be Chinese, on the grounds that there were certain jobs required for these infrastructure projects that required skills that did not exist in sufficient numbers in Angola, which is probably true. The way it has worked out, at least as of the time of our research there, and that goes back to 2007, so the percentages may have changed somewhat, but in 2007, we were informed by the government of Angola that, in fact, 40% of the labor was Chinese and 60% was Angolan. So they didn't quite meet the terms of the original agreement, but the government of Angola was aware of that and apparently had agreed to it. But this is always a negotiated issue between China and the African country, and sometimes it gets to be a contentious issue when the African country thinks that there should be a higher percentage of local labor versus Chinese labor. So it's a very sensitive topic, and it varies enormously from one country to another. In a country like Sudan, my understanding is that the component of Chinese labor traditionally has been even higher than in Angola. But in a country like Ethiopia, it apparently has been lower than in the case of Angola.
Mm-hmm. Does it make a difference as to the strength of the government that's negotiating, the African government, in terms of whether the African government will be able to get the percentage of labor that they want in a particular project, or whether or not China will railroad this, in terms of the negotiations I'm talking about?
I think it does make a difference in terms of how tough the African government is willing to be. But in all fairness, it also does depend upon the skills available in any particular African country for implementing a fairly complicated infrastructure project. And if China can show that certain job categories cannot be filled by local labor, it's not unreasonable to bring in labor from China to do it. Where the problem arises, and this has actually been raised in the African press and in some of those countries that have a freer press, particularly like Namibia, is that the Namibian newspapers have pointed out that there are Chinese who are laying bricks, for example, on projects, and the Namibian press will say, look, we have plenty of Namibians who know how to lay bricks properly. It's not necessary to bring in Chinese to do that. And it's sometimes pretty obvious to the public that they're doing this because they're out in the open and people can see them laying bricks. So this causes problems. And this is where the government has to be tough on what kinds of skills they allow Chinese labor to implement projects on. And as a result, it's a combination of both toughness of the government and the availability of skills in any particular African country.
Because it is something, and I know we're talking about the continent of Africa, but it's something that we are having that very same conversation here in the Caribbean, and specifically in Jamaica, as to, you talk about laying bricks, work that we know Jamaicans can do, that we Jamaicans have been doing for forever, laying blocks, concrete and stones, and you see Chinese doing that. But the response we get from government here in Jamaica is that sometimes when you see Chinese doing this, that they are actually consultants on the project who are doing more technical work, but are not shy of doing the manual labor.
Well, I can't speak to the question as to whether they're employed as consultants or hired for some other purpose and also just happen to end up laying bricks. That I'm in no position to judge. Mm-hmm. But what I have heard from some Chinese who try to make the argument that no, we really have to have the Chinese laborers to lay the bricks is that, one, they work harder and longer than do the Africans. Well, that may be. I don't know. But the question is that sufficient justification for bringing in Chinese labor to do that job just because the Chinese might happen to work harder and longer hours? I think the Africans have to push back at that point, or the Caribbeans in this case, and say, look, there's some things that just aren't right. If the skill can be done by a Jamaican or by a Namibian, then they ought to have that job, not imported labor doing it, even if the Chinese are going to do it slightly more efficiently. There's got to be other costs involved with Chinese labor, transport costs and housing costs and other costs that accrue to the job.
My very special guest online, Ambassador David Chin, who is a former U.S. ambassador to Ethiopia and now an adjunct professor of international affairs at the George Washington University's Elliott School of International Affairs. He's co-authored the book China and Africa, A Century of Engagement, published last year by the University of Pennsylvania Press, and also the Historical Dictionary of Ethiopia. This morning we're talking about China-Africa relations, China's engagement with Africa in particular. Ambassador, thanks for staying with us. One of the issues of contention also that Africa has been grappling with, the analysts have been talking about, and we ourselves have been discussing here, is the idea that China's engagement with Africa is a form of neocolonialism, of imperialism. What are your own thoughts on this?
Yes, I thought a lot about this, and I think that this is an inaccurate description of what China is doing. Part of the problem is, what is your definition of neocolonialism or imperialism? And I take a pretty large, broad view of that definition, and using sort of my interpretation of the term, I don't see that what China is doing falls in that category. There's nothing concerning governance, for example, that China is doing in Africa that I would associate with neocolonialism or imperialism. It's all economically based, obviously, in a manner that tries to benefit China primarily, although there are some benefits for Africa too. I think what China is doing, if you are going to give it a label of any kind, would be mercantilism. And that, of course, has some links to Europe and North America also, and its operations in Africa. But I think probably mercantilism is a better way to describe it than neocolonialism. There have been a few Africans who have used that term in talking about China's policy in Africa, but in my view, it's a misleading term.
Informative. Change. The time is now and the place is here. Andrea Williams on IRE FM.
We're back with you inside of the African Forum, and my very special guest online, Ambassador David Chin, who is a former U.S. ambassador to Ethiopia and now an adjunct professor of international affairs at the George Washington University's Elliott School of International Affairs. He's co-authored the book China and Africa, A Century of Engagement, published last year by the University of Pennsylvania Press, and also the Historical Dictionary of Ethiopia. This morning we're talking about China-Africa relations, China's engagement with Africa in particular. Ambassador, thanks for staying with us. One of the issues of contention also that Africa has been grappling with, the analysts have been talking about, and we ourselves have been discussing here, is the idea that China's engagement with Africa is a form of neocolonialism, of imperialism. What are your own thoughts on this?
Yes, I thought a lot about this, and I think that this is an inaccurate description of what China is doing. Part of the problem is, what is your definition of neocolonialism or imperialism? And I take a pretty large, broad view of that definition, and using sort of my interpretation of the term, I don't see that what China is doing falls in that category. There's nothing concerning governance, for example, that China is doing in Africa that I would associate with neocolonialism or imperialism. It's all economically based, obviously, in a manner that tries to benefit China primarily, although there are some benefits for Africa too. I think what China is doing, if you are going to give it a label of any kind, would be mercantilism. And that, of course, has some links to Europe and North America also, and its operations in Africa. But I think probably mercantilism is a better way to describe it than neocolonialism. There have been a few Africans who have used that term in talking about China's policy in Africa, but in my view, it's a misleading term. Primarily, it's a question of having access to new financial resources that Africa did not have beginning in the late 1990s, particularly, and especially starting at the beginning of this century. Again, if you go back to the Angola example, at the beginning of this century, Angola looked to the West to come up with very large loans in order to rebuild the country after 30 years of civil war. And the West, at that time, looked at the possibility of aiding Angola, said, my goodness, you people have a lot of oil, so do you really need these big loans? And finally they agreed that, well, if you do need some loans, you do need some outside support, but we're going to attach some political and economic policy conditions to our loans. This is sort of coming out of the World Bank and the major Western donors. And Angola said, look, these conditions are too onerous. We're really not interested in taking loans with all of these conditions. China stepped in and said, look, we'll provide the loans at terms that will be very attractive and no political conditionality. And Angola immediately said, well, why should we negotiate with the West on this issue? Let's just take the Chinese loans, which they did. And as a result, the Angolans got their infrastructure projects on conditions that they found far more sort of reasonable and from their perspective. And the Chinese companies built fairly decent infrastructure projects. That was not an issue. And the Angolans are relatively happy with the arrangement. And now China has done the same kind of thing throughout much of Africa, at least resource-rich Africa. And they've done it in cases where the West just either hasn't been able to or hasn't been willing to come up with equivalent amounts of financing. So in that sense, China has made available money that was not otherwise available.
As you talk about mercantilism, I think it's something that we have to think about too, even within the context of how Africa is benefiting. Because of Africa's historical relationship with the West, and let us talk in recent times also, in particular Europe and the United States. We've heard and we saw the U.S. president recently on his trip throughout the continent talk about that this is not a Cold War. We want Chinese engagement with Africa as much as we are engaging with the continent of Africa. But in a way, there is a Cold War going on, isn't there, on the continent of Africa between China and the United States?
Well, there are two things going on, and I'm not sure that I would refer to it as
China and the United States.
Well, there are two things going on, and I'm not sure that I would refer to it as a Cold War. There is certainly commercial competition between the United States, for example, on the one hand, or the West more generally, and China. But I could say the same thing about the United States and France, or the United States and the United Kingdom. There's commercial competition going on around the world in terms of trade, in terms of bidding on contracts, trying to win contracts for companies from your respective countries. That's a very normal sort of situation, and I don't really see it being any different between China and the United States as between the United States and Germany. In terms of the Cold War, I normally think of political ideology. And what China is doing in Africa today is not really ideologically based. There is the question as to whether the Chinese economic model is appealing to African countries and whether China is pushing that in its relations with Africa. But even that is a little different than what I would describe as the Cold War. I don't see that much going on by way of political competition between the West and China in Africa. It's more normal economic competition. And to the extent there's any political competition, it tends to revolve around one, in the case of the United States, one big issue, and that is the United States wanting to encourage democratization, better human rights practices on the continent, whereas China's position is simply not to get involved in this. And as a result, it has equally cordial relations with very authoritarian governments as it does with democratic governments in Africa. And from the optic of the United States, that creates difficulties because it provides the more authoritarian governments a way to escape, if you will, pressure from the West to democratize or to improve their human rights. So at that level, there are concerns and there are disagreements. But there are other areas where the United States and China actually collaborate or cooperate in Africa, such as encouraging political stability, supporting UN peacekeeping operations, working in places like Somalia and Sudan and South Sudan to minimize the political differences there. So it's a very mixed bag, and it doesn't have the ring of the Cold War to me. And in fact, both Presidents Bush and Obama have underscored that this is not a zero-sum game in Africa for the United States and China. And
I mentioned that within the context of a question that I asked earlier, how is Africa benefiting? With this active competition between China, or between the West and China on the continent of Africa, is Africa, from your research, from having been there, I mean, your experience on the continent of Africa, understanding how things work there, is Africa benefiting, or is Africa managing to leverage this competition between the West and China on the continent of Africa?
Africa, of course, we're talking about 54 countries, so there's going to be variation from one to the other.
Yes.
But if I were to just generalize, and of course there are exceptions to every generalization when you talk about Africa, I would say that for the most part, the governments have been able to leverage Chinese engagement in Africa to their benefit, again, going back primarily to these very large loans that a number of them have received, loans that they may never have received from any other source. Mm-hmm. Now, we can go back and debate whether China gets more advantage out of these loans than the African country does, and I could argue that that may very well be the case. But if the loans were not going to even be offered by any other source except China, then the African government can, I think, legitimately claim that they got something out of it. What the African government has to do is to be, I think, increasingly tough in their negotiations with China as to how these agreements are agreed upon and ultimately how they're implemented. And I think in some cases the African government has not taken full advantage of what has been offered by China and not gotten the best possible terms. But I think that there have been advantages to the African governments by what China has offered.
And what would these advantages be?
Well, mainly that a very large loan was offered where they simply couldn't get that loan from any other source. Mm-hmm. It's just, in other words, China's filling a void of sorts.
What does this mean for the African relationship with African government's relationship with the IMF, with the Paris Club, with the World Bank, those multinational, those lending agencies which have been engaging with the continent of Africa for the longest while?
Well, in a way, it's given some of these African governments a little more leverage vis-a-vis the World Bank and the IMF particularly. The bank and the fund have followed sort of Western leadership for decades, have found it increasingly difficult to impose conditionality, especially for resource-rich African countries that can say, like Angola did, look, if you're going to impose that much conditionality, thanks but no thanks, we'll just turn to China and take our loans there so we don't have to deal with it. Mm-hmm. On the other hand, China has interestingly been increasingly engaged itself in the World Bank and the IMF. I believe China has the third highest subscription rate today in the World Bank, I believe right after the United States and Japan. And it's either third or fourth, if I'm not mistaken, in the IMF. So while China, on the one hand, is offering terms for loans to African countries that to some extent undercut the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund, it's becoming increasingly important in those organizations. I think it's doing that because it wants to have a greater impact upon the leadership of those two organizations and be in a stronger position to, in effect, change perhaps the way they operate.
And we have just a few minutes left, Ambassador, and so I want to go to another issue, which is that of competition now on the continent of Africa. African manufacturers facing competition from China's goods. Let us talk about that, because it seems to me as if there's one mistake that is being made on the continent of Africa, and you can help us to understand this, it might be in this area as it is also with migration. And I think both of these things are connected. What are your views on that?
Well, I would agree that this is perhaps the most troublesome area facing China at the moment. It's a combination of Chinese relatively cheap products undercutting African manufactured goods of similar kind and roughly similar quality, and yet China is usually able to sell its products more cheaply in Africa, even after transportation costs, than are the African countries, and that does hurt African industry. The textile industry was severely hurt 7, 8, 9 years ago by imports from China, India, Pakistan, and other countries. So this is a major issue. The other side of the issue is the small Chinese traders who are physically moving to Africa and working in the same markets often that Africans do, and then undercutting those African traders and because of their work ethic or whatever, and in some cases making it difficult for some of the African traders to continue employment because they're not competing with the small Chinese traders. These two issues, I think, are perhaps the biggest ones facing China and Africa today. And they're aware of it, but they don't quite know how to deal with it because the government doesn't have total control over this. So the migration of Chinese to Africa is done on a private basis that has nothing to do with the government, and it's a real problem.
What, if any, lessons, and you've been looking at this and writing about it, what if any lessons can Africa and the Caribbean learn from this aspect of Africa-China engagement?
Well, ideally, and it might be a little easier for the Caribbean than for Africa because there are so many African countries, the degree to which, as a region, they can speak with a single voice in terms of some of the policies that they use in interacting with China. For example, following local labor standards, local safety standards in Chinese companies. The Chinese are sometimes lax in this. And if the Chinese are only hearing a complaint or only getting a policy direction from one country, it's not going to make much impact. If the African Union could speak for all of Africa and insist that there be standards for how the Chinese companies operate in Africa in terms of following labor practices and safety standards, it might have a greater impact. The more that the countries of the Caribbean and Africa can speak as one, rather than, in the case of Africa, 54 independent voices, it will have more impact upon how China reacts, because China does react to pressure from the Africans. They're not interested in what the West is saying about Africa, China, but they are interested in what the Africans are saying, or in the case of the Caribbean countries, what the Caribbean countries are saying.
Mm-hmm. One of the issues that's on the forefront now in the Caribbean, and although it's particularly and specifically connected to Jamaica, is the use of as an environmental issue, which involves an area of Jamaica which is referred to as the Goat Islands. And you're saying even on issues like these, environmental issues, that what the Caribbean can do is to speak with one voice, is to do this as a uniform, a CARICOM, for example, as opposed to each individual country dealing with these issues by themselves?
In the case of environmental problems, and China has encountered them in Africa also historically, first, it's important that the individual governments underscore the problems to China. I think 15 years ago in Africa, the governments were closing their eyes to the problem. They simply saw Chinese money coming in and wanted to take advantage of that, and they were willing to overlook the environmental damage that was sometimes being done. So in the first instance, the individual government must speak out loudly and clearly if it thinks that environmental damage is being done. And if they don't, then it's their own fault. China obviously isn't going to take the initiative on that if the local government is not doing anything about it. The next step would be for environmental standards for a region where all the governments in the region are speaking out in a general sense and urging that China and other countries, not just China, follow certain environmental standards. And China is receptive to that. It understands environmental problems because it has plenty of environmental problems in China. And they tend to base their lessons in Africa on what they have done in China. And when they see problems in China with water, with air pollution, that they fully understand. And they don't like to carry on those same bad practices outside of China.
Ambassador, I want to thank you very much. Just before you go, though, I'm sure that you have your eyes on the meeting that's currently underway in China. Do you want to comment on that in any way? The way forward is now being discussed by the government of China?
Well, this is the third plenum that I believe started today, and I think it's a 3 or 4 day meeting. I'm not an expert on internal affairs in China, but everyone who is tells me this is a very, very important meeting, and then what comes out of it may dictate the economic future of China, or at least over the next decade. So in that sense, it's obviously a very important meeting, and it will have implications I'm sure, for China's actions outside of the country and its relations with other countries. Most of the decisions seem to be focusing on internal issues in China, but because of the importance of the Chinese economy to the global economy, this is clearly going to impact the rest of the world. So it's a very important session.
Ambassador David Chin, I do hope that our government and some of the agencies who are very concerned and have questions about China, Caribbean, China-Jamaica relations were listening to this conversation this morning and can find some, in what we have said, some ideas as to how to move forward. Thank you very much, Ambassador.
Well, thank you for having me, and I enjoyed your questions.
All right. Thank you very much. Ambassador David Chin, who is now an adjunct professor of International Affairs at the George Washington University's Elliott School of International Affairs, is a former U.S. ambassador to Ethiopia and Burkina Faso. He is the co-author of the Historical Dictionary of Ethiopia and China, Ethiopia, China, and Africa. And he's also co-authored the book, China and Africa, A Century of Engagement. The book is available. It was published just last year. Also, Ambassador Chin is an expert on China-Africa engagement.
Cast interview with China-Angola model Professor David Chin. As you heard, he is the adjunct professor at the International Affairs at the George Washington University Elliott School of International Affairs. And that was aired on November 10, 2013. We're going to take a break. We'll be right back. It's the Running African Show. Broadcast interview with Dr. Professor Horace Campbell, the author of Global Nato and the catastrophic failure in Libya. And this was aired on October 6, 2013.
Professor Horace Campbell joins me on the phone lines live from China. Professor Campbell, good morning, Hotep. Welcome to the IRFM Forum, Running African.
Yes.
Okay, brilliant. Oh, brilliant. And you sound as if you're in the next room, so thank you very much. Very, very clear. You're in China this morning, Professor Campbell. We have been saying that, even though we're going to be talking about the book Global Nato and the catastrophic failure in Libya. We have read the book. We've been reading the book in the Running African Book Club, and have been talking about it among ourselves. One of the things that jumped out at me is that this book, it seems so comprehensive, so holistic, and I thought about the narrow window that you had to put this out. Can you talk to us a little bit about the research that went into the book, because it is really so comprehensive?
Well, Andrea, good evening from where I am. After 8:30 in the evening.
Yes.
Our brethren called Ras Hopton, who was way up there in the hills in section, who was a coffee grower, said next time I get on the radio in Jamaica, I should send greeting to all the Rastafari in the hills. So I'm fulfilling my promise to Ras Hopton. Yes. And I'm also sending greetings to my brethren Neville and Sister Verna, who I know listen to your program religiously on Sunday mornings. Yes. And so before I answer your question, I want to say that you have a very strong following and a very strong audience. So I'm very pleased to be on your program and to discuss this book, which I wrote as part of an urgency for those in the Pan-African world to understand the changes that took place in the world as a result of the NATO intervention in Libya, the execution of Gaddafi, and the attempts to roll back the independence of Africa. This book, for me, was as urgent as when C.L.R. James, George Padmore, and W. Du Bois stood up and spoke out against the Italian invasion of Abyssinia in 1935. And when they saw that as a lesson for the kind of war and fascism that was going to come and overtake the globe. So my book, Global NATO and the Catastrophic Failure, was a warning to the peace movement, a warning to the black liberation movement, and a warning to the world community that we should wake up to stand against the kind of militarism that is being promoted by those in Europe and the United States to solve the economic crisis. We're in the midst of the most serious capitalist economic crisis since 1930s, and there are some in the capitalist countries who believe that they can resolve this crisis through warfare. So my book, Global NATO and the Catastrophic Failure, was written as part of the campaign for peace in the world, and I'm hoping that some members of your book club in Jamaica would read the book. When I came to Jamaica, I was hoping that I could speak to the book there and have a launch of the book, but that was not to be. I'm hoping that I can still do that sometime in the spring.
You can still do that, Professor, and we'd really appreciate if that happens on the ground in Jamaica, because more and more people are just beginning to hear about the book, the amount of responses that I've been getting as a result of talking about this and tweeting and writing about it, so that would be very good. All right, so let us, I want to look at the Arab Spring and so on, but first of all, I want to understand a little bit more about NATO before we get into those specifics. And you have done that very, very well in the book. A lot of what I know and most of what I know of NATO now is coming from the book. Thank you very much for that. So help us to understand NATO and the evolving of NATO from 6 or 12 members into what we now know today as Global NATO.
Yes. The Global NATO is a formulation that I'm using to try to bring across to the concerned citizens over the world the fact that NATO was conceived of as an alliance to prevent the spread of communism. It was started in 1949 and conceived of as a military alliance to stop the spread of communism. Usually when such military alliance is formed and their mission is accomplished, that is, at the end of the Soviet Union in 1991, it would have been expected that there would have been a dissolution of NATO because its original objective had been achieved. Instead, what one saw was that the original members of this North Atlantic Treaty Organization expanded up to now to include more than 20 members and going right up to the borders of the former Soviet Union, and then with a number of other alliances such as the Gulf Cooperation Council, the Mediterranean Dialogue, the Istanbul Dialogue, they have brought in a web of alliances that is to create a military platform to protect Wall Street and, in my view, also to encircle China.
Mm-hmm. And we have heard mention of this in some of the fora that we've heard China making comments to this effect. I found it your book this point in your book very, very interesting, because this has been dismissed so many times by some of the so-called experts when China makes this assertion. So that NATO's involvement in Libya, and one of the things that you have done in the book is that you have made a connection. You talk about Wall Street. To NATO's involvement in Libya and financial banking systems. As you said in the book, this connection has not been made, but you've made that connection. Can you help us to understand that? How does this work?
Yes, the NATO turns out now to be a front for the military management of the international financial system, because since 1971, the international financial system has broken down. The international financial system that was supposed to have come into being after World War II was one that was pegged to the United States dollar as the currency of world trade and as the dominant reserve currency. And under the Articles of Agreement of the International Monetary Fund of 1944, the United States dollar had to be backed up $35 to an ounce of gold. But after the wars in Vietnam, the United States could not maintain its commitment. And so since that time, we had a floating exchange rate, and we have had the creation of what is called financial markets in the United States. So that whereas in the 1950s and 60s, the United States used to be a dominant manufacturing economy, in the 1980s and 90s, we have the development of what are called financial products. That is collateral debt obligation or credit default swaps, which are financial instruments which created a bubble. And we saw this bubble in the dot-com bubble, the housing bubble, and all these bubbles are supposed to detach the financial securities section of the economy from the real economy, where people produce goods and services, build roads, houses, schools, and plant crops. And this decoupling of the financial services industry from the actual industry created a mess for the world economy in the 1990s, firstly in Asia when we had the Asian financial crisis, then more decisively in 2008 to today, where we've had the worst economic mess since the 1930s. What has happened is that because the dollar is not backed up by anything other than the U.S. military, the United States has to project force internationally to legitimate itself. And we see the crisis of the American economy being played out before the world today with the shutdown of the U.S. economy. But for the peoples of the world, what this is pointing to is that we have to find a new international financial architecture so that we break from the monopoly of the US dollar. And I think we are now in the transition from the unipolar currency to the multipolar currency. That is, we'll be having the US dollar, the euro, the Latin American currency, the Asian currency, the Chinese RMB, and the most important currency that needs to be asserted in the world is the African currency coming out of the United Africa. And what my book pointed out, that one of the reasons for the Nato intervention in Libya was that Libya was at the forefront of organizing its resources to be the anchor for the African monetary system and for the African Central Bank, and the sovereign wealth funds of Libya of over $150 billion were being pledged to be the foundation for the transition to the African currency. And that is a threat to all countries in the world, because an African currency grounded in African resources, gold, diamonds, platinum, rubber, coltan, along with the African human resources, would make Africa a wonder for the world. And so NATO understands this, and therefore all of the countries such as Britain, France, and Italy, whose future depends on the exploitation of African resources, could not see Africa and Libya taking the lead for the African Union to start the transition towards an African common currency.
And we want to explore that a bit more, but many will say, Professor, that but wasn't the Libya situation part of the wider Arab Spring? What happened in Tunisia, what happened in Egypt? How could we make this out to be something else?
Well, before I answer your question, let me say we don't call it the Arab Spring, because Libya, Tunisia, and Egypt are part of Africa.
Of course.
And because we have published a book from Pambazuka called it The African Awakening, and we talked about the structural conditions in Africa that is leading to this awakening. We see that going on today as we speak in Sudan. So it's a process that began in Tunisia that is still ongoing in Egypt. Today in Egypt, there are demonstrations on the street because the third phase of the Egyptian revolution is going on. Let me get back to the point about the economic stakes that were involved.
Yes.
The international financial crisis is real. In Western Europe, they attempted to create a currency called the euro, which was supposed to alleviate the dependence of the European Economic Community on the US dollar as a reserve currency, because the United States was in this continuous deficit. The Europeans, however, involved themselves into these markets of financial instruments, and countries like Greece, Portugal, Spain, Italy got trapped into this financial crisis. So there is a real economic financial stress within Western Europe, and we should not get around this, that these are very dangerous times in relationship to the economic conditions in the world. It is what is disquieting for North America and Western Europe, that in the midst of this financial crisis, it is the countries such as China, India, Brazil, and the African countries that are showing economic diversification. In fact, it is in Africa where we see the most rapid changes at the economic level, primarily because Africa was not involved in the speculative financial products that were called derivatives. In other words, the very only development of African financial markets turned out to be an asset in this global economic crisis, so that everybody now is moving towards investing in Africa, because when they invest in North America, they are investing in dubious financial products. But when they invest in Africa, they're investing in real infrastructure, gold, African diamonds. And one of the reasons for my book is that in the past, the Jamaican, Caribbean, Pan-African communities were linked up with the African Liberation Project, so that they acted together from the time of Garvey and C.L.R. James and Walter Rodney with the African Liberation Project, so that the future of Africa was tied up with the Caribbean. We're trying to use this book to bring back that linkages that was started by Garvey and Padmore and Nkrumah, so that the Caribbean community is not distracted by the superficial ideas that comes out of North America and Western Europe. And for my brothers and sisters in our movement called the Rastafari movement to get back to the basics of African liberation, that was the anchor for our movement 50 years ago, that some of my brothers and sisters are caught up in petty disputes in so-called mansions, and they're not involved in the sophisticated discussions that characterized the Rastafari movement at the time of Kwame Nkrumah, Patrice Lumumba, Fidel Castro, when the Rastafari movement produced great thinkers and leaders like Bob Marley and those Peter Tosh. So we need to go back to a moment when the intellectual culture in the Caribbean rises above the intellectual poverty of North America.
And that point is well made in the book, and even for myself resonated. I remember at one point, reading the book and looking up and saying to my husband, and I was kind of if and butting through it, because something really got to me, that just reading this and reading through the book, I'm beginning to rethink the Pan-African movement, the Rastafari movement, and I'm saying the way we're doing it, because this was my conclusion in the middle of your book, the way we're doing this is wrong. There's so much that we are not talking about, so much that we are not paying attention to. And so I got that point from the book, and I really do hope that others will buy this and read the book, Professor. Another thing that you have brought to the fore, and I know we kind of glazed over the so-called, because many people know it as Arab Spring, the African Awakening.
We're going to get back to that.
Yes, I want to get back to that. But another thing that you taught that came forcefully home to me through reading the book is how you've situated France and the actions of not just NATO but France in particular and the colonizing forces on the continent of Africa. But it dawned on me while reading that we also have to talk about our African leaders and African leadership. If it is that we can have Senegal, for example, as you pointed out in the book, being the first to recognize the NTC moving outside of the Africa Union and so on. Why is the Africa Union for want of a better word, so impotent in situations like this, like what happened in Libya?
Yes. Okay. But we will come to the African Union, but let us discuss the African awakening and the revolutionary momentum that's going on in Africa at the present moment, because it is a revolution that is in its original days, and we still have 5 or 10 more years of it to wind itself through. What are the conditions that are giving rise to this African awakening that started when Mohamed Bouazizi set himself on fire in Sidi Bouzid in Tunisia? What is it that brought the people of Egypt out on the streets for those 11 days that brought down Mubarak? What is it that is bringing out the young people on the streets of Khartoum today to fight for better conditions? The bottom line is this same economic crisis is brought to the forefront the fact that we are living in societies all over the world where the wealth of the society has gone to the top 1%, and the bottom 90% of the population, mostly the working poor people, they have caught hell. So the conditions of unemployment, hunger, poor education, absence of health care, lack of housing, and the violence that is promoted among the young people in these conditions have brought a crisis of conditions of life for the majority of people. And the people, young people, says enough is enough. And so they set about using social media, using the ideas that came from the women. And what I think, Andrea, you should remind your listeners that it was a young woman who went on the television in Egypt using social media to say, why are we sitting down when Mubarak has $70 billion in his family and we as a people are sitting suffering? So the Egyptian revolution was sparked by the women, by the social media, and now we are in a stage in Egypt where the conservative militarists, along with their ally America and Israel, are seeking to hijack the Egyptian revolution. But this attempt to hijack the Egyptian revolution will, in my view, not go very far. So we cannot make any definitive statement about where the revolutionary process will go. What is important for people in societies like Jamaica is not to be distracted by the propaganda war of the West. That we in Jamaica should be asking ourselves, how do we organize politically so that we end unemployment, gun violence, and the structural conditions that are in Jamaica that are similar to the peoples of Egypt, Tunisia, Sudan, and all over Africa?
And you've done this throughout the book in terms of pointing to the lessons. We keep saying global Nato and the catastrophic failure in Libya, but the book is also lessons for Africa in the forging of African unity, and that's important because throughout the book you point to the different lessons to be learned, and we want to talk about that. We have so much to talk about, Professor, that it cannot be a one interview. Let me just say that. So much to look into. All right, so obviously lessons to be learned. Let us quickly for our listeners, because this it was good for me to read more about Egypt. A caller called earlier and asked a question, and I said when you come on, we will go into that, because one of the things that I found really interesting in the book was that we talk a lot about when we saw the NATO incursion in Libya, that we were focused on oil, but you have in the book gone beyond that, and you said Libya was important for not just oil, for water and for other reasons. Can you help us to understand why Libya was that important, and to whom?
Well, the future planning for the unification of Africa will be based on unifying the water resources of Africa. And Africa sits on vast oceans of underground water. One of the biggest is the Libyan aquifer. It's like a big ocean of fresh water. And Europe knows this, especially France, which has always had its eyes on this water. Gaddafi had spent $25 billion for a great man-made river to try to bring back parts of the desert, to reclaim the desert. In the plans for the unification of Africa, the progressive wing of the global Pan-African movement, we are discussing plans for great canals to replenish Africa. We want to see the building of a canal from the Congo River, mainly the Ubangi tributary of the Congo River, right up to Lake Chad. Lake Chad has lost 1/3 of its water because of global warming. So the conception of Pan-Africanism that is coming out of Africa today is how to use these vast water resources for the well-being of the African people when 300 million people in Africa are without water. And when we have institutions and organizations of the United Nations talking about bringing water to Africa, it is actually a double speak, because all the planning of the World Bank is to privatize water and to put the water of Africa into the hands of foreign companies so that you disempower and disenfranchise Africa from the most important resource in Africa, that is African water. And every week we're hearing about these water resources. Last week we heard about another great ocean of water under Kenya, which is an area of Turkana, and the engineering that is needed to harness these resources means that in societies such as Jamaica, we should be sending more of our young people to engineering schools instead of to business schools, because in the future planning for the regeneration of Africa will require water engineers, construction workers, and the kind of technical expertise which will be consistent with the regeneration on diversification of Africa in the 21st century.
Mm-hmm. Another point you made in terms of the importance of Libya in all of this was solar energy.
Yes.
Let's talk about that, because this is something that we totally missed also.
Well, as you read in the book, there's a German company called Desertec that has plans for setting up a vast solar plant across the desert in North Africa to provide power for Western Europe. We know from the technology that is being developed in solar energy, especially in Germany, Korea, in China, in Japan, and in Spain, that in the next 5 years, the solar revolution will have an impact on energy the same way that the cell phone has had an impact on telecommunications. And what we need to do in planning for the democratization of the delivery of energy is how to harness solar energy in a way in which this technology can be used at the lowest level. I live in China at the moment. I'm speaking to you from Beijing. I just come back from the countryside, and in the 300 kilometers that I traveled from Hebei province back to Beijing, every house in China has some sort of solar panel, so that heating for homes and the technology is at the lowest level, so that the technicians on the streets have the capabilities how to repair solar. Now, what about a country such as Jamaica, where there is sun more than 300 days out of the year of 365? Why are we not planning at the educational level, at the level of our institutions, for the diversification of the energy production in Jamaica, so that Jamaica could become a different kind of place? That's because we do not have the leadership. And this is where the Rastafari has to go back to its roots, because at its origins, the Rastafari movement, when it started at Pinnacle, was a movement to develop agricultural self-sufficiency, housing self-sufficiency, skill self-sufficiency, cultural self-sufficiency. Now, my wing of the Rastafari movement, we're going to create intellectual self-sufficiency so that we can bring all of the traditions of the Rastafari back to where it was, because we believe then, as we believe now, the future of the Jamaican people is tied up with the liberation and dignity and prosperity of Africa. So my book is in the tradition of the original Rastafari movement that sees the future of Jamaica linked up with the future of Africa and the future of African people everywhere.
Talking to Professor Horace Campbell, who is talking to us live from China. His book is called Global Nato and the Catastrophic Failure in Libya, Lessons for African in the Forging of African Unity. Professor, we want to take a quick break. When we come back, we're only going to have half an hour. As I said before, this must be one in a series of discussions that we have. We want to also invite some of our listeners in the studio in one of those discussions where they can ask questions. But we have a few issues to deal with so that we cover the book as best as possible. And that is my own ambivalence, let me just say that, about Gaddafi. Let us talk about that. And also, how did NATO fail in Libya and the lessons to learn from that? We're speaking with my very, very special guest, Professor Horace Campbell. He's speaking to us live from China. Once again, let me just encourage our listeners to get a copy of the book, Global NATO and the Catastrophic Failure in Libya. Let us read this and have our discussions in our communities, in our clubs, whether it's book clubs or African clubs, in our meetings and so on. I think it's very important for us to do that even after the program is finished. All right, so Professor, I want to quickly kind of shift gears a bit. Well, we talked about, you also mentioned in Libya, why Libya was important, it was four things. One was the oil, water, solar energy, and also...
It's back to our feature.
Going on in these societies. And when we develop the intellectual sophistication, we have to distinguish between the individual leader and the principles around which we stand for with anti-imperialism. In other words, as a Pan-Africanist, as someone who comes out of the tradition of African liberation, I was opposed to Gaddafi. I had lived in Uganda when Gaddafi aligned himself with Idi Amin to attack Tanzania. And I am part of the Dar es Salaam School of Tanzania, along with Walter Rodney, that saw Tanzania as a fountain of the support for African liberation. So Gaddafi was misguided then. Gaddafi was misguided when he supported Charles Taylor and those people in Sierra Leone and other societies in Africa to support basically gangsters who presented themselves as freedom fighters, like Charles Taylor and Fode Sanko. So what this book is saying to those in the Pan-African movement, that we have to develop a sophistication so that we can critique and oppose Gaddafi, but we have to oppose even more Western imperialism in Africa, because this is a bigger contradiction than any contradiction we have with Gaddafi. And it is that kind of political and intellectual sophistication that we have to bring to the table so that we do not have any simplistic understanding. And in the end, the way in which Gaddafi was executed was basically to send a signal to every African leader that whoever you are, we can deal with you, we can kill you, we can sodomize you, and then we can put your body into a freezer like your meat. This was an attempt to humiliate Africa. So this issue of the NATO intervention went beyond the person of Gaddafi and struck at the root of the question of the dignity of Africans. So whether you agree with Gaddafi or not, you believe in the dignity of Africans in life and death. So one was opposed to the treatment of Gaddafi in the way he was killed and sodomized and the way he was executed on the orders of the French president, because the French president and the French ruling class had so much to hide based on their allegiances with Gaddafi. So I am saying that just as in Syria today, we may oppose the political leader Assad because he's been there for a long time with his family, but we're even more opposed to the jihadists that are being supported by Saudi Arabia and Israel and the right-wing forces in the United States of America. And that kind of sophistication must guide us so that we do not make snap decisions about international politics.
Interestingly, what you've done in the book also, you included in the book Gaddafi's will, but you also talk about the violation, contravention of the Geneva Convention by NATO forces in the way Gaddafi was executed, and as you pointed out just now, talked about the importance of understanding the manner in which Gaddafi was executed for African people to understand that. I want you to talk to us about, is it Sirte or Sirte?
Yes,
I had, in reading the book, an aha moment, because what you've done is to show us the importance of Sirte. You've said that this is important for the African Union, for the forging of African unity, for us to understand the importance and what happened there. Talk about that quickly, Professor.
Yes, that is very difficult to speak about quickly because
yes.
CERT becomes important because Gaddafi was rescued by Nelson Mandela. He had been labeled an international terrorist and Libya was labeled as a rogue state. And Mandela, who himself had been labeled as a terrorist, went to Gaddafi and says, let us put whatever is on the table and negotiate what must be negotiated over this question of the Pan Am aircraft. And Mandela himself shuttled between the leaders of Europe and Gaddafi in 1 week to say, we are going to resolve this question. So we have to see in Africa the importance of the leadership that came out of the African Liberation Project and African diplomacy. Because of the success of Mandela in ending the sanctions against Libya, Gaddafi called an extraordinary meeting of the Organization of African Unity in CERT in 1999. At this extraordinary meeting, they laid down the discussions for the creation of the African Union. And within 2 years, we had an African Union. And I think this is the importance of CERT and the importance of Mandela and his relationship with Gaddafi. And up to now, Western Europeans and North Americans have not woken up to the fact that we have a new international body involved in international affairs called the African Union that brings together 54 governments in Africa, which is basically a holding operation, because African Union that brings together 54 governments in Africa, which is basically a holding operation, because those of us from the Garvey wing, the Nkrumah wing of the Pan-African movement, we want one union government, and we're pushing through our intellectual work and through this book for moving in that direction. So CERT becomes important because it was the birthplace of the current African Union.
And you point also to the message that is inherent in the total alienation, the total destruction of CERT. And what is that message to the African Union? What is that message to us as Africans?
The message from France and Britain is that we are not going to tolerate unity in Africa. And what they do is that they try to associate African unity with Gaddafi in order to discredit the African Union. They put propaganda in the minds of African young people. Africans are too divided on the basis of so-called tribe and religion to be united, and they have sent in their mercenaries, as they have done in places such as Mali and Central African Republic and Somalia, to create instability so that the project of African unity is hijacked. But we are not going to worry about that, because as we have seen in Mali, that the African Union have now sent forces into Mali along with China. In the Democratic Republic of the Congo, the African Union has sent forces from Tanzania and South Africa. And one of the things that your listenership should do is to get on board with discussions on the work of the African Union to accelerate African unity. Just this week, a decision was made in Ghana to hold the 8th Pan-African Congress in Ghana next year. And the number one issue on the agenda for this Pan-African Congress is the full unification of Africa. So I think the level of literacy inside our community in Jamaica needs to be advanced, because when the Prime Minister of Jamaica went to Addis Ababa in May of this year, she got a whiff of this sentiment for unity, so that leaders from all over the world are sensing something new is going on. So the president of Brazil, the lady would say to France that Brazil is not going to accept any more French intervention because Brazil wants to get on the good side of Africa. So we have to get beyond the Western propaganda to see that something new and alive is going on in Africa, and that the Libyan intervention by Western Europe has brought home to the African peoples that they cannot depend on the current leadership, because many of the current leaders are compromised by the fact that they've stolen the money from the people. The money is in the banks in foreign countries, and their people are poor, and they go out begging for aid. So we need a people-backed African Union, and the people-backed African Union is the kind of unity from below that started the African independence process in the 1930s. And that is what my book is seeking to align with, that movement and momentum that is going on over Africa.
All right, we're going to jump quickly, Professor, to the next point on the failure of NATO in Africa, and also quite a few responses, lots of responses coming in from our listeners, so hopefully we can get in a few. If not, then we'll pick this up another time. But the book, indeed, is NATO's Global NATO and the Catastrophic Failure in Libya. Lots of the reports that came out after it was declared that, NATO was a success, the NATO intervention in Libya was a success, and you talk about this in your book, but you're saying no, this was a catastrophic failure. How so?
It was a failure because the NATO forces and their diplomats used the pretext of responsibility to protect to go into Libya to say they were protecting the people of Libya from the government of Gaddafi. But when they finished, more than 50,000 Libyans were killed. That the situation in Libya is far worse than it has ever been in the history of Libya. There are 1,700 militias running around all over the country. Not even their oil companies that were hoping to benefit from Western occupation can do business there, because there's been an oil strike for the past 2 years. It has been a catastrophic failure because of the instability for the lives of the people of Libya and for the mess it has created in North Africa in releasing the jihadists, that is, those fundamentalists and extremists that were organized by NATO along with the private military contractors to overthrow Gaddafi, to the point where the United States ambassador to Libya got caught in that whole mess, and he himself lost his life on September 11th. So it is a mess all around in Libya today.
What do we know of the current situation in Libya? Libya, as many might have noticed, is totally out of the news, except for yesterday there was a report of an Al-Qaeda operative leader being captured in Tripoli. But what do we know of what's happening on the ground today in Libya in terms of stability, in terms of social and political conditions?
Well, you see, these reports that come out, you treat them with a grain of salt, yes. Because when the Western news provided information, they said that this leader was wanted for the bombing of the U.S. Embassy in Kenya and Tanzania in 1998.
Yes.
2 years ago, they said that they've killed all of the leaders who were involved in that. So we will wait until we can authenticate what happened in Libya yesterday, because we know that part of what NATO does is to use Western media sources to carry out psychological and propaganda war against the people of the world. So this so-called war against terror, we are very cautious about it, because when they say they're fighting war against terror, why are they supporting the same terrorists in Saudi Arabia and in Syria? They're financing the same jihadists. So we are very cautious when we see these Western reports. Yes, thank you for that question.
And in terms of the situation on the ground today, what do we know, Professor, in terms of the political situation?
The situation on the ground is horrible for people, especially for women, because there are militias everywhere and there's no peace in Libya, especially for black Libyans in Tawerga who were called mercenaries, and 30,000 black Libyans from their city have been driven out of their homes and they cannot go there. This is a matter that all people of African descent should be bringing to the United Nations, that there must be investigation of NATO of what is happening to these people inside of Libya today.
And as you mentioned, the black Libyans, one of it, there's so many components, so many elements to the book and even for myself as a media practitioner, that we have to sit down and take apart and look at our own complicity in all of this. Media in Jamaica, you talk a lot about the Western media. And I'm sure that, as you have been doing throughout this interview, that you have made the connection to the role of the Caribbean, the role of the African diaspora in forging African unity, and the lessons to be learned here. But I found that there is a big lesson, a great lesson to be learned, Jamaican media, Caribbean media to be learned, and we all need to read your book, because Caribbean media regurgitated. You talk about the psychological warfare, Western media being used as part of war. But Jamaican media, Caribbean media regurgitated CNN, the BBC, Al Jazeera, and so on. And people were even proud to say that we were quoting Al Jazeera because it was Arab media. But from our own perspective, Professor, as Jamaican media, we made some very serious mistakes. Well, they made some very serious mistakes in how we regurgitated information they regurgitated information from the Western media.
Well, let us go back to the origins of the Rastafari movement and Marcus Garvey. In our original movement, when the Western press called someone like Patrice Lumumba a murderer and a terrorist, the Rastafari movement would say Patrice Lumumba is a freedom fighter, would say Nelson Mandela is a freedom fighter. So when someone like Bonnie Wheeler would make a song about Patrice Lumumba, it was part of the educational process going on among the Rastafari to explain to the people who is Patrice Lumumba and who is Kwame Nkrumah. We do not have that process going on. In fact, the University of the West Indies has lost its political anchor in the society, because it is basically as cool to turn out people in MBAs and business, and it has lost its role in the Jamaican society as a place to bring knowledge and to link up. And 50 years after independence, there's no serious African studies at the University of the West Indies. So we cannot blame the masses of the Jamaican people and the media. We have to look at what kind of leadership is coming from the two political parties. And that is why the work you're doing, Andrea, in this program and IRA FM is so important, because from this interview, it has shown me that you've taken the time to read the book and that you're doing this interview from an informed perspective. That is a kind of normal Jamaican media person we need at this moment in human history. And I want to applaud you for the kind of work that you're doing in Jamaica to lift the intellectual culture of our society.
Thank you, Professor. So leadership is important in this debate, and this is, and we are going to have this conversation. I think it's a continuing, and this is a definitive moment, I think, for myself in the space in which I stand, and I know for many others, as we continue to look at your book and to have conversations with you. We've had some responses, which from our listeners on Facebook, for example, Patrick Howell is saying, too much damn talking, he says. We are people of chatting. When we are going to do the work, he said the professor spoke about energy in Libya. But what is Professor Campbell doing to assist the OUR who are now struggling to find... I'm losing it. Struggling to find a bidder for the 360 megawatt power station. He says Professor has to apply real life. Jamaica need, which is what you've been saying actually, Jamaica need doors and not just bystanders. But this is exactly the point you're making, isn't it, Professor?
Well, I think what we should remind the listeners is that I was not a bystander. I invested my time in bringing out an intellectual work which could be part of the impetus for the doors in our society. So this book did not just jump from the sky. Someone had to do the intellectual work. And that's what my argument is, that there are many talkers in the society, but we're not doing either the intellectual work or the practical work to meet the challenges of our society.
As far as you're concerned, from your perspective, what would the practical work entail for the young Jamaican who is listening today, the African Jamaican who's listening today, who's saying, from this interview, from this discussion, I'm not just going to read the book, but I need to get up and move?
Yes, well, I can only draw from where I stood as a young person in Jamaica. When I was a young person, I belonged to a community where we looked up to those in our community who were striving towards changing the conditions in their communities. And they did this either through getting into education, into business, into skills, or into new forms of community organizations. And we had socialist principles in our communities. One socialist principle that was very strong in our community was something called partner, where people contributed money every week. So someone was building a house who had a field to do things, they would contribute money. There was a certain level of cooperation within the community. What we've had in the era of neoliberalism is this individualism, me get rich, support gunmen, support violence, support masculinity, violence against women. All of the distortions of our community is manifest in the badmanism that we see, where the gun culture in the society could elevate someone like Dudus to become a central cultural icon in our society, and the politicians cannot develop the kind of mechanism to say what happened in Tivoli Gardens in 2010. That is a statement of why the young people are misguided in Jamaica. So we have young people trying to assert themselves through athletics. We need to find a diversion from the kind of political violence that is promoted in the community by the capitalists, so that the Jamaican working people are divided.
Running African, Professor Horace Campbell is on the line. He's talking to us from China. And Professor, I want to talk in the 6 minutes a little bit about China. So please allow me to do that. But a note from Muta Baruka, who's listening, Cutting Edge, Running African. He says, doing the work, other media houses need to come to grips with it as it concerns Africa. Thank you very much for that, Muta. And I'm sure he's saying hi to you too, Professor.
Yes, I want to see Muta. Yes. We met last at the conference of the Rastafari that was held in late August in Jamaica. Yes. Let me say to your audience, I am teaching here for a semester in the #1 university in China, which is Tsinghua University, the most distinguished university in a country of 1.4 billion people. Now, I taught in the best universities in the world, but as a Jamaican, nobody would seem fit to invite me to teach in Jamaica, because my views about Africa, Rastafari, and the dignity of black people is too dangerous for those who run the university in the West Indies. So I am here as a guest of the Chinese, and I'm in the middle of the transition that is going on in China, because the Chinese have been able to build a strong, independent, and dynamic society. Of course, there are a number of problems in China, but the struggles of the socialist construction in China is what has given the foundations for China to be a powerful state that it is. All week, from October the 1st until tomorrow, October the 7th, the Chinese have a holiday. And that holiday is for the 64th year of celebrating socialism and the building of socialism by Chairman Mao. And I think we need, the Prime Minister of Jamaica was just here in China, and we need to have more Jamaicans coming to China to study Chinese, to study engineering, and to see the kind of ways that the young Chinese have the confidence of can-do, that they can build a new society and they can own the society. When you walk around China and you see these Chinese people, they're not trying to run away to America or to France or to Britain. They want to build their societies. And what we need in Africa is the kind of leadership, the kind of ideas that can inspire our young people to say they can have a future where they were born.
Professor, right now, ongoing discussions in Jamaica about China in Jamaica. Of course, we're also looking at China in Africa. But there's ambivalence, and I know where there's ambivalence, there are going to be questions. And it seems as if when people are ambivalent, then others take this to mean that they are opposing. It is not quite so. How, in the few minutes that we have, and I know it's not enough time, how would you suggest that we view China-Africa relations?
Reggae Radio.
That we have, and I know it's not enough time. How would you suggest that we view China-Africa relations? I mean, China-Jamaica relations?
Well, I think we need some time to discuss this in great depth,
yes,
because this is not a simple matter.
No.
This matter of the projection of Chinese economic and diplomatic power throughout the world is a new thrust. Right now, we have going on in the Asia Pacific Economic Forum that is going on in Bali in Indonesia. If you follow the meetings that are going on in Bali, Indonesia today, one would say if you're from Indonesia or Malaysia or from Singapore or South Korea, China is all powerful and projecting power. Jamaica has to see itself within the projection of Chinese power globally. It's not China is projecting its power in Jamaica. It's a new strength of the Chinese capabilities internationally. What we have to do is how do we develop our power to be able to match their power instead of sitting down and complaining about it. And that is why our branch of the Pan-African movement sees the future of Africa as a unified economic force that can be a force in world politics, because make no question about it, the Chinese power is here for the next 10 to 20 years. The only way you can match that is to develop your own power, to be able to develop alliances internationally, to be able to negotiate with the Chinese.
We're going to leave it there, Professor. We have to continue these conversations, and I do hope that you'll be able to come to Jamaica later on to launch the book, and by the time you come, we hope that many others would have read the book. Can you say how can persons in Jamaica and those who are listening to us on the internet at irfm.net access and get a hold of the book?
They can write to Monthly Review, which is in New York, or they can order the book through Amazon.com. And when we get an invitation to launch the book in February or March in Jamaica, we will try to ship enough copies down. I tried to interest some bookstores in Jamaica when I was there, and they said, oh, we're so busy with school that we can't be interested in a book about Libya. But I hope from this discussion there will be an audience for a discussion not only about Libya, yes, but for the importance of African unity to meet the changed global economic situation.
Right, and we do ask our listeners, because many persons have been writing to ask where the book is available. Call your bookstore, call Sangsters, call
Amazon.
Yeah, I know, but I'm just telling. Yes, call them to ask if they have the book, because the more calls they get, then they'll go in search of the book. Thank you very much, Professor. Really appreciate you taking this time off. It's almost night time now, I understand, in China, so we really, really appreciate you coming on. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, and say greetings to all my brethren and sisters all over the island.
Thank you very much. We'll do Professor Horace Campbell there, coming to us live from China, where he now teaches, as he just told us, at the leading #1 university in China. And isn't it a shame that someone like Professor Campbell would not be invited to teach at the University of the West Indies? We have lots and lots of questions to ask of ourselves.
News Voice.
Good morning. I'm Lanagay Green with the local and international headlines. The Halfway Tree Police yesterday charged 2 men with illegal possession of firearm and ammunition. They are 30-year-old Brian Baxter and 21-year-old Kamar Winter, both of Tavern Drive in Kingston 6. Police say about 5:30 a.m. yesterday, lawmen were conducting a spot check on Old Hope Road in St. Andrew when they instructed the driver of a motorcycle with a pillion aboard to stop. The driver attempted to elude the police, but was later intercepted and searched. Police say they seized a Sig Sauer 9mm pistol with 5 rounds. Both men were arrested. They are to appear in the gun court on Friday, October 10. 4 men are in police custody following the seizure of 10 rounds of ammunition along the Portmore Toll Road in St. Catherine. Reports received from the Portmore Police are that about 1:30 a.m. yesterday, lawmen were patrolling the area when they instructed the driver of a motor vehicle to stop. The driver refused but was later intercepted. The vehicle was searched and the ammunition found. Finance Minister Dr. Peter Phillips says passing the International Monetary Fund IMF tests creates stability in the Jamaican economy. He says passing the tests means that Jamaica is meeting its targets in instituting key economic reforms, enabling the country to draw down on funds to promote growth and employment. Speaking in an interview with JIS News, Dr. Phillips acknowledges that there are difficulties, but he states that if Jamaica was not passing these tests, life would be tremendously worse here. In news overseas, Hong Kong's police have used tear gas to disperse pro-democracy protesters outside the main government building after a week of escalating tensions. Demonstrators trying to push through police barricades were earlier repelled by pepper spray. Protesters want the Chinese government to scrap rules allowing it to vet Hong Kong's top leader in the 2017 poll. Hong Kong's chief executive said the demonstration was illegal and elections would go ahead as planned. Finally, Liberia's chief medical officer has put herself under quarantine for 21 days after one of her assistants died from the deadly Ebola virus. Bernice Dan, a deputy health minister, said she had no symptoms but wanted to take every precaution. The World Health Organization says more than 3,000 people have died from Ebola in West Africa. Liberia has been the worst hit by the disease, accounting for 1,830 deaths. 150 in the last 2 days alone. Health workers have been particularly vulnerable to the virus, which is spread by the infected bodily fluids of patients. Those were the local and international headlines. News next at 11:45. You can go online to ariafm.net to view some of the stories. Like us on facebook.com/ariafm news. Follow us on Twitter at
2013.
Let me welcome Dr. Yoon Jung Park to the program. Thank you very much, Dr. Yoon, for joining us from Washington, D.C. this morning.
It's a pleasure. Thank you for having me.
All right. This is an ongoing discussion that you've joined us in the middle of in terms of on a weekly basis that we have been looking at China-Africa relations. We've been looking at China and Africa. Obviously, we have lots of questions. Jamaica is seeing a similar situation as we see unfolding on the continent of Africa, and so it is especially relevant to us. But where we left off the last discussion is how does Africa leverage China-Africa relations? Before we get there, your own perspective of the of China-Africa relations. How did this historically come about, and where is it now?
I think one of the first points that needs to be made is that while one might be able to speak intelligently about China-Jamaica relations, because you're talking about relations between two countries, when one mentions China-Africa, you're talking about an entire continent.
Yes.
And dozens of countries. And so when we try to examine historically what's been going on, it's very different depending on which countries in Africa you are speaking about. Mm-hmm. So I think we need to perhaps specify. If I can generalize at all, it would be to say that while China-Africa relations generally has been getting a lot more attention in the last several years, these aren't new ties at all. In fact, they've existed since African countries first started gaining independence from their colonial powers. So they reach back to the 60s and 70s. Mm-hmm. In those earlier periods, relations were much more ideologically based. In other words, China was very interested in helping African countries gain independence. They were very much part of the anti-colonial, anti-imperial movements. That's changed in recent years. In the last decade or so, the relations are much more practical and they're much more based on economic ties. So if we're able to generalize at all, that would be one of the few generalizations that one could draw.
And one of the things you've said is that Africa is a continent, and we have to look at it as such when we're talking about China in Africa. And to specify, and I want to go there. We've been focusing a lot here on China in Ethiopia, for example. But talk to us about China in West Africa. Is this different on China in Ethiopia, for example? But talk to us about China in West Africa. Is this different from the relations, different from, say, China in Eastern Africa or even in Central Africa?
I actually think that rather than making those regional distinctions, it might be more helpful to look at a few other factors. One would be the size of the country in Africa. So, for example, China's relations with Nigeria or perhaps with South Africa are on a very different scale than China's relations, for example, with Lesotho or with Namibia, for example.
All right.
One would also have to look at the history of ties between China and that particular African country. But in some ways, the most important thing is whether or not that country has resources, natural resources that China is interested in, or what other kinds of interests China might have in that country.
What would you say? What would you say? And I take your point clearly. What would you say is China's main interest then? Here we talk about natural resources. We heard President Obama speaking in South Africa recently, talking about an imbalance in terms of well, he didn't say China, but we can extrapolate the relationship between China and some of the African countries, as particularly he was in South Africa at the time. So what would you say is a driving force behind China's interest on the continent? Obviously, natural resources.
That's definitely one of the key interests, but in some ways I wouldn't distinguish China from any other major partner. The U.S., European countries are also quite interested in Africa's natural resources. In terms of oil extraction, China is not the biggest player, but in fact many of the Western countries, the U.S. and Canada included, have greater interest in oil extraction and mineral resource extraction than does China. So I think in some ways this natural resource, the way in which China is portrayed as only being interested in natural resources, I think is overplayed and has to do with the fact that many of the Western countries, including the former colonial powers, are concerned about competition in Africa. If I can give it a quick example, I was invited to a conference a few years ago that was hosted by the Virginia Military Institute, and they looked at relations between Africa, the U.S., and China. It was entitled The Eagle and the Dragon in Africa. In other words, the eagle being the U.S. and the dragon being Africa are tromping around, the dragon
China.
Being China,
yes.
Right, are tromping around Africa. Africa is the site or the place in which these two superpowers are playing out their own kind of game of competition. And my concern in all of this is, how does Africa gain leverage? When does Africa gain the respect that it deserves as a player and not just as a potential prize in this game? And I think this is a real concern in the way in which the the discourse has been framed.
Yes, and I think this is also the concern that we have here as we look at what's unfolding and try to understand what's happening with this new, well, people talk about Africa Rising, and that also the narrative has changed on Africa as a result of what's happening there with China and so on. Well, let's talk about that leveraging, Professor. What would leveraging the eagle and the dragon in Africa mean for Africa? How would that look?
There are a couple issues. I mean, one that often gets mentioned is whether or not the African countries that we're speaking about, and again, I think it's important to be specific about which one, but whether or not that particular African country has the capacity to govern, to dictate some of the terms of agreement for any potential negotiation for extraction of mineral resources, for deals. I have some concerns that in some African countries that there are high levels of corruption. There is you don't have a government in power that is democratically elected, that is looking out for the interests of its population. In those countries, it's very difficult to talk about leverage if the people who are making the deals don't really care about what the people actually get, if there is any benefit for them at the end of a deal-making session with the Chinese, whether it be the government or a private sector company. Mm-hmm. One also has to look at the size of the country and, again, the power of the government, but also the people of that country. And in this instance, I think Jamaica is a great example. You have a very small island nation that is partnering in some ways, at least on an international relations level, as equals with this huge rising China. And, one has to question how equal is that partnership? How equal can one make that partnership? And I think it has a lot to do with then, what are China's interests? What does Jamaica want to get out of it? Mm-hmm. One of the things that I've seen in my research is that in countries where there are laws, where laws are in existence, where they're implemented, and where there's some oversight, Chinese firms have a lot less ability to take advantage of some of the things that they've been accused of. So a lot of the environmental problems, a lot of the labor issues that have arisen in Africa, those tend to arise in countries where you don't have a strong rule of law, where those things are not maintained. You mentioned Ethiopia earlier, and in my reading of the dynamics there, Ethiopia has been much more capable, perhaps because of their current government, of kind of calling the terms of their engagement with China, of saying that, if China is going to invest, then China has to hire X percentage of the labor force from Ethiopia. China cannot come into certain sectors. Again, I think it has to do with the ability of the country, whether it's Jamaica or Ethiopia or Namibia, to call the shots. And China is, asking to come in as a player. It can't force itself on anybody and has to play by the rules of the game, if such exists.
What do you think, Eva, you mentioned earlier some of the countries that are more corrupt, some which without proper central government and so on. What do you think, though, makes a country more able than another to call the shots? Ethiopia seems to be doing some of that. We heard about Tanzania recently being able to do some of that in terms of labor laws. But what do you think makes a country on the continent more able to call the shots more than others?
Look, I think part of it is circumstances, is historical. So in a couple of the countries where Chinese firms, Chinese workers are able to take advantage of gaps in kind of legal systems and enforcement are places that are recently coming out of war, that are in the midst of being rebuilt. It creates both opportunities for potential benefits, but also of potential harm. So if one thinks about the DRC or Angola, for example, both of these countries are countries where there are tremendous natural resources, but again, where historically there have been decades of war. And I think in places like that, there is more danger that, China or whoever else is coming in to extract natural resources, to try to engage in deal making, where there is an absence of strong legal parameters, I think is potential danger, live potential danger for the publics of those countries.
One does get the impression that where China has made some serious inroads in a country on the continent of Africa, that country also appears stronger in terms of their own ability to deal with the international community. I talk about Ethiopia specifically and the Nile. This has been something that has been on the table for the very longest time, in terms of building the dam. And this is something that we have been following here since the early 1990s. Talk to us about that, because now Ethiopia is standing against Egypt in simple terms to say, listen, we are going to build this dam. We've started building this dam. The funding, of course, is coming from China. So do you find African countries being more able to stand up to the international community because of their relationship with China?
I definitely think that having China as a partner or a potential partner gives African governments another card to play. It certainly gives them more flexibility and some choices that prior to China's entry into Africa in this big way, they did not have. In my interviews with government officials in Southern Africa, and I've done research in Namibia, Zimbabwe, Lesotho, South Africa, it was very clear that those government officials appreciated having China around as a potential partner, even if they weren't necessarily going to do deals with them, to use them as a card to leverage their relations with their other political partners and their other economic partners. So absolutely, I think for African governments, for the African elite, having a potential partner in China gives them great leverage in terms of their relations with other international partners, particularly with the West. I know that the World Bank and IMF, for example, have had a much more difficult time kind of forcing their regulations and their conditionalities on some of these countries. If the country can turn around and say, well, we don't need your money, we can go to China. So that's definitely an extra card that they can play.
And is this, from your research, moving from one economic form of, and we call it enslavement here in terms of the IMF and the World Bank, to another? In other words, what is in place, as far as you know, particularly in the countries that you're researching, Southern Africa, to ensure that there is a balance? Obviously, China is coming with much more money, much more power. It is a superpower. But is Africa unfairly being used by China in, say, Southern Africa?
I'm hesitating because, again, I think it depends which country you're talking about. In Southern Africa, you have South Africa, which is, part of now BRICS and one of the more powerful players on the continent. At the same time that you have small countries with populations of less than 2 million, like Namibia and Swaziland and Lesotho. So, again, it's hard to make a general statement. I think I'd have to go back to a point I made earlier in that whatever kinds of deals we're talking about, whether they're government to government or government to private sector. I don't think China's in a position to force anything down the throat of any particular country. I do think that it has to do with whether or not there are, individuals in that country who are capable of negotiating better bargains, better deals for that country. My own opinion, South Africa is the country that I called home for more than a dozen years, and I've only just returned to the U.S. 3 years ago. There were a couple instances while I was living in South Africa where it seemed to me that the South African government, our South African negotiators, did not recognize their own potential power and kind of allowed themselves to be in some ways bullied by the Chinese and by the potential economic benefits of a relationship with China. I'm speaking specifically about incidents in South Africa where the Dalai Lama had been invited to attend various events, one of them being Desmond Tutu's birthday celebration, and the South African government did not give the Dalai Lama a visa to travel to the country. This happened on two separate incidents over the past years, and the criticism within the country, from the official opposition, but also from people like Desmond Tutu, were highly critical of both China in terms of China's human rights records, but also South Africa, the South African government bending over backwards to please the Chinese and to do something like this. In my personal opinion, I don't think South Africa had to do that. I don't think China would have cut economic relations. South Africa is too important to China, being one of the kind of linchpin countries in Southern Africa. But whether or not you have individuals within the country, decision-making in the country that is capable of seeing the potential power that they have, the potential kind of influence or their own importance to China on the continent is another matter entirely. Mm-hmm. So, again, I think you have to look at specifics. You have to look at the government structures that are in place, the individuals who are actually making these decisions, the capacity of government to actually negotiate in a way that is most advantageous to the people of that country. And again, if we're looking at Jamaica, is Jamaica going to go head-to-head with China on a specific deal and say, and call the shots and say, when it comes to labor, when it comes to environmental, regulations, these are, our stipulations. And I think that governments can and should enforce and set the terms of those kinds of engagements. China is not different from any other potential investor or any other partner. They're foreigners asking to come in and do deals. So it's within your power, your scope to leverage that their interest in your country.
Well, already we see, and we talk about Jamaica specifically in this at this point, but it's a CARICOM issue. I think it's happening in all the Caribbean countries as we see it unfolding in Jamaica. So there has to be a CARICOM response. But outside of that, I see we are already making lots of mistakes in terms of our engagement with China. You say stand up to China in terms of coming to the table as equal partners, but already we're making many mistakes in that regard. Let me take a quick break, if you will, Dr. Yoon, and when we come back, I want to look a little bit at some of the human rights issues that have been raised in discussions about China-Africa relations. Freelance researcher, she has affiliations as a senior research associate of the Sociology Department at Rhodes University in Grahamstown, South Africa, and visiting professor in the African Studies Department of Howard University in Washington, D.C. Dr. Yoon, let's go to the human rights concerns. We had a discussion a few weeks ago about this, and we heard references, not clear enough, but subtle references from President Obama about some of these issues while he went through Africa last week. How is the China's attitude to human rights issues playing out in areas such as Sudan in Africa, an area which we're focused on seriously in this program? We heard earlier, a few months ago, that one of the reasons why Sudan was allowed to violate so many United Nations sanctions was because of the backing of China in Sudan. What's your own take on this? What's your research been showing you?
I haven't done any specific research on issues around human rights in particular, but my reading on this is that China's policy in general is one of non-interference. So if something's going on in any country, be it Sudan or Namibia or Angola, China's not going to, and if China sees this as an internal issue, then they're not going to say anything. And this has been a policy of theirs for decades now. So what I also think their definitions of human rights aren't necessarily the same as Western definitions of human rights. And so when it comes to state-to-state relations, I think that's the way that China perceives it or argues their case for not interfering. Having said that, I have a number of colleagues who've done a great deal of research and spent a lot of time in in Sudan. And from my reading of it, at least with regard to earlier conflicts before South Sudan divided, China actually ended up playing quite an important role in ending some earlier kind of issues in Sudan, in part because they were the only country that had strong ties with the Northern Sudanese at the time. So while on the one hand they claim to be independent and are concerned about non-interference in issues of states, they actually did push Sudan towards a negotiated settlement and such. So having strong ties with the country gave them some of that leverage to do the right thing in the case of Sudan. Now, I haven't been following the situation very closely in the last year or so I'm not sure what's going on. But certainly when it came to Darfur, China came to play in a quite productive way. That potential is there. In terms of human rights, the biggest concern with the way in which China engages in Africa, the bigger concern, I think, is labor issues and labor rights and the responsibility it is of the countries that we're speaking about, where these abuses are allegedly taking place, to monitor and to engage with the illegal behaviors, with the kind of where there are legal abuses taking place, and then those countries need to call those particular Chinese to task and take legal actions.
But are they doing that, as far as we know?
In some places, yes. I mean, we've heard about, and in Ghana, again, this is not with regard to labor issues per se, but with illegal Chinese mining. The news reports that I've read talk about hundreds of Chinese who were deported from the country for their engagement in illegal activities. Now, there's clearly a lot more that could be done. But if there are individual Chinese who aren't attached to government or even any kind of firm in the country, there are multiple local government agencies that have been involved, right? I mean, we're talking about immigration or home affairs, labor, departments of labor, departments of trade that are involved. And there may be health departments. There are any number of government agencies that might be involved where there are some of these infractions taking place. And it really is up to those agencies then to call out those people who are behaving in illegal manners or who are illegally in the country, and deal with them. The interviews that I've had with various Chinese ambassadors in African countries, they all say the same thing. They say that, if any Chinese national in this country is breaking the law, then it's up to the country's officials to deal with them. We're the officials of, China. We can't control the behavior of every single individual Chinese that comes into this country. So, and they have made public statements. They've tried to deal, through local chambers of commerce, if such exists, to exhort Chinese nationals to obey the laws of the given country. So, again, I think it's a lot of the complaints about Chinese behaviors, Chinese practices in given countries are under the control of local law enforcement of ministries, and they're, in my opinion, they're not doing enough to address these situations. And if I can draw this back to an earlier part of the conversation we had, in part that might be because they're given a subtle message from their own government saying that the Chinese are our friends. We need the Chinese. We need Chinese investment. So back off these individual Chinese. And I think that those kinds of mixed messages are very harmful in the long run. Anyone who comes into your country to do any kind of investment or work needs to abide by the laws of the country, barring, the diplomats, I guess, who have immunity.
But what part does power play in this, though, the power differential? And we're talking now between China and, say, that individual country.
Well, again, I think that they're two different issues. I think it's, what is, again, if we can use Jamaica as an example, what is it that Jamaica wants to get from China? Are there particular investments? So there's, on the one level, this bilateral relationship between the government of the two countries, right? But if they're individual Chinese investors who are coming in, or individual Chinese business people, we're not talking about investment on a major scale, but traders, and if they do something illegal, that shouldn't have anything to do with the state-to-state relationship, right? Mm-hmm. And I think this is where things get confused, is where there's this mixed signal. There's an assumption then that all Chinese in the country are untouchable, and that shouldn't be the case. Those Chinese, if an American comes overseas, to Jamaica and does something illegal, then that person needs to be arrested and dealt with appropriately. If he's Chinese or Russian or French, same thing. That shouldn't make a difference what the relationship with the country is. Mm-hmm. And I think this is where it gets conflated and confused, I think, particularly with smaller countries where they're very sensitive and I think fearful of losing the partnership with China. And I guess my argument is you're talking about two very different things. Chinese individuals who are there are not the Chinese government. They're not representatives of the Chinese government. And so this power that you speak of, that shouldn't be part of that discussion.
At the individual level.
Behavior.
Yes.
Excuse me?
No, I'm saying at the individual level, private sector to private sector, or individuals who are coming in to invest. But at the government level, for example, to use an example from Jamaica, and this is just a little bit different, but it talks to power. The government of Jamaica has made available, hundreds and hundreds of acres of land to the Chinese government. This is interesting because at the same time that the government is doing that, they are bulldozing and making so many Jamaicans homeless because they say they're squatters. So a large part of the population of Jamaica is considered squatter communities. But at the same time, found lands are found for Chinese investment. To me, there is some. How are we to understand this? How are we to make sense of this as Jamaicans on the ground? Is a question, and I see this playing out across the Caribbean. I don't know the extent of which it's happening, to which it's happening on the continent of Africa.
It would seem to me that the Jamaican people need to question their own government's motivations and incentives and priorities. I mean, I think there are increasingly instances where, certainly in Africa, where civil society and the public need to speak and need to hold their own governments accountable and need to call them out when they're doing something that they think is unfair or illegal. Why would giving Chinese farmland and in the process displacing locals be in the interest of the said locals? I think, here perhaps the anger shouldn't be directed at the Chinese necessarily, but at your own government, in trying to ascertain what it is that the government is trying to accomplish in by giving China this farmland. Why is it taking place in this manner? And again, I've watched this happen in a number of African countries where, in some ways, China becomes the scapegoat for local disaffection with their own governments. The government is not doing what the public deems the government should be doing. And it's because of the Chinese. And so who are we going to take this out on? We're going to take it out on the Chinese. I'll give you an example. In Lesotho, which is a tiny mountain country completely surrounded by South Africa, mountainous and very little economic opportunities, economic investment. One of the largest investors is actually Taiwan. Taiwanese individuals who have invested in the textile manufacturing, garment manufacturing sector, and they're the second largest employer in the country. During the economic downturn, a number of jobs, thousands of them in fact, were lost because the factories were no longer able to get the contracts that they needed to manufacture. They didn't need all the labor. The newspapers turned around and said that the Chinese were actually causing an increase in HIV/AIDS. Now, the logic there was the women who were working in the garment factories had lost their jobs. They were turning to prostitution to try to make ends meet, thereby increasing rates of HIV/AIDS infection. All of this was turned around and blamed on the Chinese. This is, to me, it sounds ludicrous in some ways, but this is the kind of logic that often takes place because you need to find a scapegoat. You need to find someone to blame. And oftentimes it's the fact that your own government isn't taking care of the needs and looking out for the needs of the people.
And then there's also
not in the way that the people deem best.
I want to just backtrack a bit to look at the human rights component, because we talked about the policy of non-interference, China's policy of non-interference, and but is that also in that way? Does China find itself propping up through investment? And I talk about government-to-government investments now. The corrupt countries that are abusing the human rights of their citizens, and is China totally? Does China have to reconsider its policy of non-interference, considering the inroads that is making in countries where human rights abuses are as they are? I mean, there are questions about China itself, but should this be a coming together at the table to talk about some of these issues?
I think personally that China is going to start changing the way in which it engages in some of these countries, not necessarily because it is concerned about human rights per se, but because of its own public image. I think China, if it does indeed intend to become, a global power, a superpower, engaging in international organizations and such, needs to start taking more seriously its public image, and its public image as a human rights abuser is not something that plays out very well. So it may not be for the best of reasons, but I do think that these policies are being reviewed and rethought in Beijing. So absolutely, I think I also have colleagues who've been doing research on Chinese kind of lending practices and things like that, and they're saying that rather than kind of a Chinese way of doing things, that they're actually coming to evaluate potential lending and things much in the same way that the IFC or the IMF might do. So I do think that there's a process that's taking place, and as China kind of figures out its own role in kind of global power dynamics and things, that some of these things will change. Again, I'm not convinced that they're changing for necessarily the right reasons, the most humanitarian reasons, but because it wants to maintain its image, it wants to maintain its power. So it is changing. It is taking place. And I think the one thing that I've learned since I've been doing this research is and reading up on the way China is engaged in different countries is that it's on a very steep learning curve. All of the Chinese officials that I've spoken to and increasingly Chinese researchers on the ground in Africa are able to take information back to China and help China to kind of engage more fruitfully and in a way that's hopefully more responsible in terms of human rights issues, in terms of environmental rights issues, again, if not for its own sake, then for the sake of its reputation.
Mm-hmm. One of the things that was talked to us here in Jamaica was recently Jamaica engaged in building a highway across the country. A Chinese company was involved in that. One of the things that was, for persons who weren't paying attention, shocking, was the amount of Chinese labor that came into Jamaica. Many people thought that Jamaicans would be employed to work on this, but there was just, and this we see repeating itself across the Caribbean and certainly on the continent of Africa. Can you help us to understand that?
There are a couple of factors. In Africa, this has also been one of the main complaints about the way in which Chinese, particularly construction firms, have operated on the continent. I think it has to do with a couple things. One is the nature of the contract and the time frame of that construction contract is important. If the Chinese are given a very small window to get something done, and that's been kind of pre-negotiated, based on their evaluation of existing labor in the country, they might end up making a decision that it would be faster and cheaper for us to just go ahead and bring in our own labor, because with Chinese labor we don't have to look at deal with local labor laws. And things like minimum wage provisions and work hours and things like that, they can then avoid, right? So if it's a short-term contract, or if they've kind of ascertained, already that they wouldn't be able to get it done as quickly using local labor, then they'll bring in their own.
But it seems to me that determination, sorry, Prof, it seems to me that determination is being made even before the investors come in terms of begin the work, that we're going to be taking in our own labor, because you come with the labor. You don't start with the local labor and then say, well, this is not working out because of the working hours. You do 9 to 5 or 9 to 6, and we're not going to be able to finish on time, and so on. So the determination is made, and it seems to me as if governments have somehow signed off on this to the detriment of their own people. Yes.
I think the point that you made, the last point that you made, is critical. Is whether or not the government signed off on it. Again, if we go back to the Ethiopian example, in Ethiopia, I can't remember its exact percentage, but on any given project, they will not permit more than I can't remember if it's 10% or 20% of the labor on any project to be from out of country. In fact, and different countries in Africa have stipulated for various contracts that 70 or 80% of all the labor used on this project must come from that country. So again, the government, as the contract is being negotiated, is in the position to negotiate these things. And should, in fact, be held responsible for ensuring that some percentage of the jobs that are created, even if they're short-term temporary jobs, go to locals. I imagine in Jamaica, just as in Africa, unemployment is a huge issue. And for locals to see a bunch of Chinese pushing wheelbarrows around is disheartening, when they can't put bread on the table because of lack of jobs. So this is a huge, huge concern. But I do think governments can do more to negotiate prior to that project being stamped, rubber stamped.
You mentioned
that. And if I can just finish,
yes.
in countries like Zimbabwe or in South Africa, where there are stricter laws or where they have a very capable workforce, the Chinese do not or cannot bring in the kind of labor that we're talking about in other places. And I completely hear you. I was recently in the Bahamas, and there's a huge Bahama Mar construction project, which is being undertaken by the Chinese, and I saw lots of Chinese obviously working on this project, and I had the same kinds of questions. I wonder, what proportion, how many locals have they hired to work on this? Are they bringing in? In some countries, like in Angola, it honestly does have to do with the lack of skilled labor. If they need people to be able to drive big trucks and operate heavy machinery, and things like that, and you don't have the people with that level of training, and where it's again where you have a short time frame, and because of language differences, it's difficult to engage in these kinds of on-the-job training exercises. It's challenging, but again, I would say that it's the government's responsibility to ensure that some percentage of jobs is brought in, that some level of on-the-job training, capacity building is built into a project as it's being negotiated. These are all things that local people, that civil society can and should push for if they know that there's a deal being negotiated with a Chinese firm, or with any firm for that matter.
You're listening to the Running African Show.
And this is where I was going, because you had mentioned earlier South Africa and South Africa not knowing its own power from what you'd noticed in terms of the invitation to the Dalai Lama, etc. And so I want to go back there briefly in terms of looking at how governments, Caribbean governments and African governments have been responding to Chinese investment. So much emphasis has been placed on foreign direct investment, and especially in a time when there is recession and so on. So governments are really happy to have China coming in and investing. But there seems to me also that the thrill of knowing that there is some investment going on is a priority, and so that the welfare of a nation and of its citizens in a lot of these countries are being pushed aside. In the last 9 minutes that we have, Professor, can we go back or to go forward to look at leveraging? And I know you're not a government advisor to any of our governments listening, but they are listening, and so too is civil society. And let us talk about leveraging and how, from your research, you've seen this working. How can it work? And what are some of the issues that governments should be thinking about as China begin to invest more and more in their countries?
I think, again, one has to kind of differentiate if you're talking about the Chinese government or state-owned enterprise versus a private sector company, then Jamaica or whoever is doing the negotiating has different capacity to leverage depending on who the potential partner is. With the state-owned enterprises, one might be more concerned about the relationship, the long-term relationship with the country. But with the private sector firms, they're not representatives of the country. If you want the investment, then negotiate the best possible deal. I think part of it is that, as you said, smaller nations, whether they be Caribbean nations or smaller African nations, they're so excited about the possibility of doing a deal with China that they throw out all of their other kind of normal considerations out the window. And I don't think that you need to do that. That's not necessary. China's there at the table because they have some interest. Look at them as you would any other potential player. Perhaps the threat is, you're one of many small island nations, and if China's not going to come into Jamaica, they'll go someplace else. But I think Jamaica needs to kind of be able to properly assess its own value and its worth and kind of the importance of Jamaica within the kind of Caribbean. What is it that sets it aside? Why is China interested in us? How can we play off of that? How can we kind of get the most benefit off of that? I think the other thing that has to be repeated is that, if you want something to work properly, if you're, what are the priorities? If you're interested not just in the value of the actual investment, but in things like job creation and job training, capacity building, then those things need to be negotiated into the deal. If we're talking about a long-term agriculture project, for example, if that land is being given to the Chinese to do agriculture, then how many Jamaicans are going to be trained in efficient farming techniques, for example? Those are the kinds of things that need to be kind of thought about, the kind of long-term benefits, the lasting benefits of any kind of investment that comes in, not just the short-term kind of initial money that comes in. And if I can say, civil society really does need to hold their own governments accountable on these matters. What is most important? Is there going to be pesticides, agricultural chemicals being used? Is there going to be runoff into local water? Those kinds of environmental assessments, the kinds of things that you mentioned earlier about people being dispossessed of their land, being forced off of their land. Is there any compensation for that? How are these things being addressed? And I think it behooves the publics to find out as much as possible in terms of the details of any particular deal that's going down with your own government and the Chinese or the Americans, or if it's Shell Oil or whoever's coming in, then it's the public needs to find out what the details are of those deals and try to hold government accountable and say no when it is something that's absolutely abhorrent to the people of that country. If hundreds of people are being dispossessed and they're not being compensated, if there's going to be environmental havoc wrought by the kinds of agricultural activities that are being undertaken, if there are no jobs created at all, those are all things that I think the people need to speak up about. Your first port of call, your first kind of people to talk to would be your own government officials.
And I noticed, as you talk about training, I noticed, for example, in Nigeria and some of the other Western African countries, that scholarships, China is making lots of scholarships available. I thought that was interesting, and something that can be used as part also of a leveraging, considering, for example, the Caribbean situation and Jamaica in particular, where the cost of education is as expensive as it is. That this is also one area in which, governments negotiating can make a difference.
Absolutely. You know, and to China, it doesn't make that big a deal, right? I mean, what's 2 more scholarships? But to Jamaica, it might be a very big deal. So, you know, that's something that doesn't really cost them a whole lot, but to throw in scholarships or capacity building projects for government officials, there are all kinds of things that one could negotiate in that wouldn't necessarily be a great expense for the Chinese, but could make a huge difference for the Jamaicans. And things like getting Chinese healthcare professionals. I know a number of African countries are benefiting from Chinese doctors and health facilities, or to get the Chinese to come in and build schools and things like that. The Chinese are engaging. And I guess this is where I heard part of your earlier show about whether the bigger question about whether or not China is another neo-colonial power coming to play. I think China is clearly a rising power, but I don't think it has the same colonial aspirations as the Western powers had when they, you know, were going through their imperial kind of activities earlier in history. The Chinese are looking for natural resources. They're looking for potential markets. They're looking to increase their international power at international organizations like the UN. So if the China can count on Jamaica as a friend, then that's huge for them. If China can count on all of the Caribbean countries and all of the African countries to be on their side when a vote comes, that's huge for them. So there are reasons why China is engaging with these smaller countries. But I don't think China wants to come in and have all Jamaicans kind of start thinking like Chinese, or start, you know, kind of, it's not a cultural imperialism. It's not about that. It's about very practical things, in my view. It's about increasing potential markets. It's about, you know, gaining access to those natural resources, and it's about making friends where China desperately needs them. So they have their motivations, and I think it's up to the Jamaicans and to, you know, the Namibians and the Basutu to determine what it is that they want to get out of the relationship with China, and not just fall over backwards because, oh my God, China's the newest, best, biggest thing on the block and we need to become friends.
And I think that is very well said and very important. Dr. Yoon Jung Park, you've really helped us to understand a bit more, a whole lot more actually, the China-Africa relations. And thank you very much for making yourself available, and also for opening up your research, which I know that you're doing for us also, and helping us with the networking on this as we begin and try to understand this new development in our progress and in our history. Thank you very much, Professor.
Thank you for the opportunity.
All right. Thank you very much. All right.
Yeah, man, this is Clive, a.k.a. Chris Zogo, you know. Well, you can give me a minute to make a talk to your listeners, them. Yeah, man, this, you're talking to Muta listeners from Jamaica, US, Britain, and the world, you know. Especially the one them with on YouTube and BOBS and Roman channel. You know, for over 20 years, Muta, I highlight problem them and I get solution. But, you know, I face black people, but Muta alone can't do it alone, you know. But all we do, as them listening, we do, we talk and we complain amongst ourselves and pass blame and we with government, white man, rich man, and Jah and Jesus to solve them. Black people, if you know, say, and a responsibility that other people solve them problem, you know. If you know, say, the man we have been put by his neck, now take it off and let you lick it off and pump him in the face and stick in a thing short. Government has do good, you know. Because you see them a drive Pajero. And the regular artists, them alright, because them don't make it. And you see them a pop champagne, flat BMW, and a be a big mansion, but, you know, them not be no factory for employ. You know, the problem that I face working and poor class don't affect them. I can't believe how fool on be, you know, they're wait for same people who cause the problem to fix it. We complain about foreigner buy up Jamaica, but instead, we buy up Jamaica, we buy up foreign goods. They don't know where the things say then get the money from. I see the money when you buy them goods then use back and come buy up Jamaica to use against you. They complain about Monsanto, but we shop at the supermarket all the time. And we don't even try to create our own supermarket that we sell our own organic food. So we leave it up to them to solve our problem what them create. Marcus Garvey say, if you can't do what other races do, you don't deserve to die. And that is exactly what happened to it right now. If you can't own the wholesale like the China man, you don't deserve to stay poor and jobless. If you can't own the multinational like the white man, you don't stay at the bottom of the political and economic system and big IMF. If you can't own the big farm like Monsanto, you don't deserve to die from cancer and death of famine. Muta give you no solution to your problem. But Muta, you alone don't have the money to solve a big problem, yeah. So if we put the money together, we can create the big man, big corporation, or big business that will represent our interests and agenda to work to solve our problem. I say, we don't say already, if 1,000 Muta listeners put $1,000 US, that's $1 million US, 100 million Jamaica can set a foundation, start a business. We are going to invest in building and expanding black business like farm, supermarkets, car creator, transportation, etc., which will provide wealth and jobs amongst our own by ourselves. Talking and complaining is good, because they highlight the problem. But it's time to build business and structure to solve the problem that we complain about so much. Every race have them structures set up. That is why you can see Chinese come from China, set up shop, and start it out with our Chinese need. All a black man know to do is just be a buyer. You can't even blame the Chinese, because they're not doing it for yourself anyways. My solution, I know the be all and all, but it's one thing that is in your power to do and can create a system that will outlast us all alive now, Muta is the only man in Jamaica I feel that is trustworthy. That is why I'm willing to invest $1,000 US in him to set up a business to build our system. There must be at least 1,000 of him listeners who believe in real self-reliance. If not, I guess Black Jamaican is doomed to want to be beggars. $1,000, I don't know, why? Because Jamaicans spend more than that on ganja, liquor, bleaching cream, clothes and car and big house, etc. Overconsumption. If you don't have 1,000, then you know what? Can't get 10 people to join you as one then. So we want all the serious Muta listeners them to email muta@irfm.net. Call up and tell them say, you're ready to invest in him to build a phone system. So that me want to the people in Muta.
Blessed man, give thanks. That sounds serious. That sounds very, very